Hello, I'm Caillou, and welcome to VerDeckT, a deck tech show in which I go over a deck that I've recently played, talk about its strengths, weaknesses, and card choices, and ultimately deliver the final verdict. Is it worth playing or not? Today I'm going to be talking about the other pod. The other pod is basically named because Sultai Midrange with What Lurks Beyond was the first real breakout pod style deck in MSCM. What Lurks Beyond is green sorcery, sacrifice a creature you control, search your library or graveyard for a creature with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus that creature's converted mana cost, and put it onto the battlefield. It was a mid-range deck which basically went over the top with chains up with you used Ancestral Council to find What Lurks Beyond, you chained it into Archive Guardians to rebuy What Lurks Beyond, you found Scion of Desolations to then bring back your creatures. It was basically a grindy mid-range deck which was always trying to get to this explosive game plan of getting out of Scion of Desolation and then rebuying your entire graveyard. So with that in mind, I was thinking about well, this seems pretty cool. But one card that hasn't been seeing a lot of play recently is this card, Caller of Hunger. A while back, Just Nobody theorized a deck using Caller of Hunger and another card I'm going to talk about, Xera, to have an infinite combo. And while his deck only played one copy of Xera and was essentially used other tutors to find it, mine goes a little bit harder on using Xera both as a combo piece, but also as a fair ramp tool. So the main game plan is you have a Caller of Hunger, and you also have a Xera Scatterer of Seeds. So essentially, whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield, you untap all lands you control. This means that if you have a Xera out and a Caller of Hunger, and at least 3 lands, what you can do is you can essentially loop creatures until, and then you just have, as long as you keep searching for creatures power 4 or greater, you can just keep infinitely podding. If you have 4 or more lands, you can also generate infinite mana, or infinite being the number of 4 power creatures in your deck. Now you might be thinking, hold on, you can't have an infinite number of 4 power creatures in your deck. Well, you can, because of Warden of the Dead, which is a make card, which whenever it dies shuffles 3 copies of itself into your library. So that's essentially the central core of it. I'm now going to go over and talk about card choices one by one and how they performed. So the first one is Xera Scatterer of Seeds. I originally had this at 3 copies, and I thought that it would mostly be a combo piece, but what I found is that Fair Xera is incredibly strong. Just being able to chain because we have 4 power creatures that draw cards on ETB, so just being able to chain those and then build out a huge board state turn 3 or turn 4 is something that you can just get over a lot of control decks or a lot of other fair decks and just outrun them. So I'm not sure whether the current 3 copies or 4 copies is the best home for this, but I think overall this card has exceeded expectations for me. The next one, one drop, is Mana Ascetic, the classic, Birds Without the Wings. So I basically just use this as another ramp piece, another creature to potentially pod off into other 2 drops. It's generally solid. I don't know that I need 4 copies, to be entirely honest. I might remove it and put in more impactful cards, because the deck generally isn't really trying to accelerate for the most part. It's trying to just curve out. So I think Mana Ascetic is obviously a very good card, but I'm not sure if it's a good card for this deck in the numbers that it's currently at. So now we're going to get into the 2 drops. We've already talked about Caller of Hunger. One important thing to note is that you often, depending on what your opponent's doing, you don't really want to play this on 2. Obviously, if you curve this from Xera into this, and then potentially to turn 3, turn 4, killing your opponent, that's really good. But otherwise, waiting until 5 so you can immediately get value out of it is actually pretty reasonable, especially given the rest of your deck composition. Also, don't be afraid to pod itself to either because in response to removal, you can easily just pod itself find another Collar of Hunger, and that's just really strong. Um, so I think, yeah, in general, it's a combo piece, a fair piece, and also is just like good both in the early game and the late game. Very solid. So the other 2-drops we have are mostly one-ofs. We have a Farseek, which you might be wondering, why do we have this with a bunch of 1-mana ramp? Well, Farseek is actually there so that we can get the turn 3 kill. And so essentially is you drop one of your 4-power 3-drops, which we'll talk about later, and then you pod it all the way up into an Ethereal Spellmaster. Find a Farseek. The Farseek will let you get to 4 lands. This means you can start going mana positive, and being mana positive is important because you can loop a Warden of the Deads, as we saw earlier, but then you'll lose 1 life each time they ETB. So what's the point of it? You'll generate infinite mana, but you'll also die. Well, what you want is, you either want Paka the Shadow Cloak, or you want a Twilight Blade. Twilight Blade is the better option for comboing off because it gains you 1 life each time, so you can have you basically have infinite looping possibilities at that point. Oh, and yeah, and you want infinite mana because so that you can pod something. You can essentially like grab, let's say, a Snowfield Mother, get the token off of it, and then pod the token into a Twilight Blade. Because to find Twilight Blade, if you find a Twilight Blade, it doesn't have 4 power, so you won't untap all your lands. So, and you need to keep podding to actually use it. So you do need that infinite mana, or at least going mana positive to some extent. So the reason that Paka is in here as an alternative is that it also fulfills a similar purpose to Twilight Blade without the life gain, but it's much better in like a fair plan because of the tail conclusion, which allows you to basically 2-for-1 your opponents a reasonable amount of the time. Other interaction at 2, Pithwilt at 3 copies. It is the best removal spell in the format right now. No surprises there. Point, click, kill anything 3 CMC or less. In fact, if I might cut some of the clunkier cards and move this up to 4 copies. That's how good it is. The last 2-drop is Chi-Li of the Underworld. So I unfortunately, in my league run, didn't get to play much with this. But the original plan was it's a very strong card in the fair game plan. It's another 2-drop in a deck that is kind of overloaded on top end. So it provides something to do with the early game. And also the 4/4 that it creates allows you to trigger a Xera without having to use any mana, essentially. I never drew Chi-Li. I want to test it more. I think it has the potential to be very good in this shell. So getting into the 3-drops. Both of our 3-drops have 4 power. And here we have Wellspring of Creation. We're going to see it's basically the main reason that this deck splashes blue, because it's a strong 4-power 3-drop. I have 3 copies of this, and it's really good against control because of the Can't Be Countered rider, because of the anti-sack rider. It comes in handy against like Exint. However, from playing this card, it really has underperformed. It really has mostly just been like a 4/4 beater, and like while it works well with Xera, what I found is that often the cards in this deck need to be better in a vacuum for like the grindy mid-range plan to work out. So honestly, Wellspring of Creation is one of the first cards I would cut if I was to continue playing this deck. On the other hand, Bloodjade Prophet is the reason that this deck skews heavily black, and it is probably the best card in this deck. It's at 4 copies, and being able to essentially have a 4-power 3-drop, so it enables you to combo off turn 3 if need be. It can draw up to 3 cards and also has like insane card selection. It allows you to start putting on a clock early if you want to like go turn 2 Paka, turn 3 this, and then start putting pressure on your opponents so they're forced to like respond to what you're doing instead of being proactive. And all the while you've drawn a bunch of cards, so you don't really care. Bloodjade Prophet is just I think the linchpin of this deck. While Xera is the enabler, I think Bloodjade Prophet is kind of the tie that makes it so that the deck can run smoothly. It gives you, because of the card flow, and because of the 4 power. So yeah, I would not go below 4 copies of this. Okay, so we're now moving into the 4 drops. We have Snowfield Mother at 4 copies. Um, Obviously, an incredibly strong card, smaller Thragtusk. The main reason for this here actually is A, to create tokens when you're comboing off, so that you can later pod that token into like a Twilight Blade. Because if you just go off with let's say Collar, Xera, and another creature, you want to that other creature you want to keep podding it into Warden of the Deads, but at that point you won't have something to pod a Twilight Blade into without disrupting your combo. So a Snowfield Mother's token gives you something to use the infinite mana on, and so that you can pod into the Twilight Blade instead of like trying to draw it off Warden of the Dead, which isn't as reliable. And the life gain means that like even if you have Paka as your enabler, you can still usually just kill your opponent before you die, just because you're mitigating the life loss from Wardens with the Snowfields. And as we've been talking about, Warden of the Dead, just really strong in this shell. One thing that I did not consider is just this deck definitely needs card flow, and I put this at 2 copies because I thought I would mostly be using this in the combo part of it and rarely casting it. But Warden is really great when you're Xera chaining, so I might move this up to 3 copies. It's just a really strong fair card as well, is what I found. And it kind of and the deck will I didn't want to overload the deck on top end, but I feel the deck is planning to essentially live till turn 4, turn 5, so and grind out the opponent, so it's not too bad of a plan. So next up are the 5 drops. These are all 1-ofs. So we have Reclamation Grove Sculptor. I originally put this in here because it's a greater than 4 power creature, which you can pod into while comboing. If your opponent has let's say a Guiding Light. Guiding Light would, so Guiding Light right here, it essentially gives your opponent hexproof, and they will choose hexproof from black to prevent you from comboing off. Reclamation Grove Sculptor can turn it into forests that you can combo off. However, I think whenever I drew this card, it felt kind of underwhelming. I think I would move this to the side in favor of another Scion of Desolation. So Scion of Desolation is probably the best 5-drop in the deck. It is one of the best fair cards in the deck. It makes it so that you can rebuy combo pieces. It makes it so that you can just rebuy Bloodjade Prophets and refill your hand completely. It is really good to either pod into or to just draw naturally and play. So I think that Scion of Desolation, I would move it up to 2 copies in favor of the Reclamation Grove Sculptor. The next one is not a card which functions with Xera, but it still gives you incredible value, Ceaset Tremond. Like Scion of Desolation, it's a 5-drop Death Toucher, but the main thing is that it essentially draws you to your best card from your deck and your best card from your opponent's deck. I think Ceaset is just one of the best value-oriented cards in the format, and even though it doesn't work with Xera, I think there's absolutely zero shame about running it here. And finally, the 6 drops. We've talked about Ethereal Spellmaster before. I would actually think about cutting this because I think you're rarely actually comboing off on turn 3. You're more often going to just wait and combo off on turn 4 or later in the game. So I think Ethereal Spellmaster, while it was a cute solution to be able to get 4 lands on turn 3, more often than not is just a dead draw and isn't something. And I think it's skewing the deck blue is actually kind of so that you can cast it fairly is not really necessary if you're also removing Weldsprings, which I think is probably the best course of action. And finally, of course, it's the Mama Wolf herself. If you're playing a creature deck that's planning to go long, this is the best explosive creature in the format. If somehow your combo game plan gets disrupted, you can still just pod up into Lair and Alpha and then basically create a 1-card board. I don't think there's much else I need to say about it. So I'm going to quickly talk about our sideboard choices as well. Archive Guardian is there for grindy matchups. Usually, one thing that can happen is if you don't draw Bloodjade Prophets, this deck can run out of gas surprisingly quickly. So Archive Guardian is something that helps with that. In other grindy matchups, you also have a second copy of CS Atreament out of the side. So both of those together should help with grindy matchups. For versus combo, this deck basically has no no interaction for combo decks that aren't creature based. So you have 4 copies of Duress out the side. This also helps versus control, but I don't think that you bring in the full 4 copies versus control. This deck also struggles a lot because of versus aggro, because of its Bloodjade Prophet takes a heavy toll on your life total, as does Warden of the Dead and your mana base. So out of the side, I have 3 Rot. Rot also functions well versus like enchantment spam decks like Legend Weaving or Villainy, but it's also just a general point and click, shoot all your things dead. We also have Stand Unassailable, which works better against Burny type aggressive decks. And it's also really good because the Coalesce is pretty easy to turn on, actually. Like, once you get to like turn 5, and if you're Xera chaining, you can just essentially like net mana into a Stand Unassailable and then still untap all your lands and keep going because it has 6 power, so it triggers Xera. So both of those cards together are, I think, strong hedges against aggro out of the side. Finally, versus control, you have another copy of Tenacious Guide and another copy, or not another copy, you have a copy of Tenacious Guide and you have another copy of Wellspring of Creation. Wellspring because it can't be countered and is good against most of the Exeunt style removal, though Pithwilt being on the rise makes it less of a viable choice. Tenacious Guide because just making all of your stuff uncounterable is essentially just a win the game button versus control. I think in another iteration I would take out Wellspring of Creation from the side and add another Tenacious Guide, just because of how strong it is to have this come under their counter magic. So one thing is, where would I take this deck in the future? I think there's 2 variations I would try. One would be cutting the blue entirely. The mana base is very painful. You're only using the blue for Ethereal Spellmaster and Wellspring of Creation, neither of which are particularly good from how I've played. And I think green-black would like solidify what the deck is trying to do, and make it a lot more streamlined. I would replace Wellspring Creation with probably some generically good cards like Intrepid. Unfortunately, though, Intrepid is a 4-power technically creature. It's not a creature on ETB, so it doesn't trigger Xera. Still a really strong card. It also gives you access, and if you go straight GB, it makes it like much easier to, along with Intrepid, play the package of Monument of Queens and Nereba, which are some of the best lands in the format for grindy decks to use. So I think that would be a really good idea for a future iteration of the deck. Another possibility is going into white. White gives you access to Merciful Eroda, which is another strong 4-power 3-drop that is good in a fair game plan. Of course, it doesn't line up well into Intrepid itself, and Intrepid is a very popular card in grindy decks these days, so that's definitely a consideration. But white also gives you access to Demon Worthy, which is the best removal spell in the format. And because, like we mentioned earlier, like utility lands being so strong in grindy decks recently, Deem being able to just point and click kill them is definitely a consideration to make. Another thing might be is if you want to go harder in on the combo, probably another Xera, but also Blood Artist doesn't lose to Guiding Light and other such effects. So if you're worried about that, though it isn't currently played, that is definitely a switch that you can make. I think Paka and Twilight Blade both having 2 power is something that has been really important from playing the deck in my experience. So I wouldn't make this change, but if the meta changes, that's something that could be done. So here's a layout of the deck as a whole, as I played it. And my final verdict is, should you play this deck? I think absolutely yes. It's a blast to play. It feels like you always have a relevant play. You're either just playing a fair game plan and then just curving out on your opponent and always having a bigger threat than they do. Sometimes you're playing Xera turn 1 into Caller turn 2 into Bloodjade Prophet turn 3 and then just killing them. Sometimes you don't have the Caller, but you have a Xera, and then you just dump your hand with Bloodjade Prophet plus Xera. So I think if you like decks which are incredibly explosive, but also want that fallback plan of being able to outgrind your opponent, the other pod is the deck for you. But yeah, let me know what you thought of this this VerDeckT. This is my first time doing this, so any feedback would be really appreciated. Also, let me know in the comments if there are any decks you would like me to take through a league and try out. But yeah, until then, this is Caillou signing off.